From the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain, this is Democracy Now!
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention. Because this election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people.
A landslide victory for the Conservatives in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Brexit is now irrefutable. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn is stepping down. We'll speak with journalist George Monbiot and Priya Gopal, author of Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Descent. Then Cop-Out 25? While deadly droughts, flooding, cyclones, and wildfires rage outside the UN Climate Summit worldwide, the rich countries most responsible for the climate emergency have spent the talks dialing back ambition and blocking progress. That's what activists, scientists, indigenous, and grassroots climate leaders are charging in these last days of this year's climate conference. We'll also look at how global heating is already displacing tens of millions of people.
What we're witnessing around the world is that the climate crisis isn't just changing ecosystems, isn't just raising sea levels, it's forcing people to leave their homes.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're reporting from the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain. In global news, the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party won a landslide victory during Thursday's decisive national election, dealing a devastating blow to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Corbyn has said he'll step down as head of the party after a period of reflection. It was the Labour Party's worst electoral defeat in 84 years. The Conservatives are projected to win 364 seats in the British House of Commons versus only 203 for the Labour Party. This would give the Conservatives the largest majority since 1987, when Margaret Thatcher was in power. This is Labour Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell.
Look, I know they're heartbroken, I know that, so am I. They worked incredibly hard, incredibly dedicated. We have setbacks like this in our movement, but it isn't down to them or any lack of commitment. Brexit was the issue for us.
The Conservative Party's sweeping victory all but guarantees Brexit, Britain's departure from the European Union early next year. The party won resoundingly despite Prime Minister Boris Johnson being accused of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and sexual harassment. We'll have more on the British elections after headlines with British journalist George Monbiot and Cambridge University lecturer Priya Gopal. On Capitol Hill, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, unexpectedly called off a vote on the 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump after a 14-hour debate in the committee Thursday.
Long 2 days of consideration of these articles, and it is now very late at night. I want the members on both sides of the aisle to think about what has happened over these last 2 days and to search their consciences before we cast our final votes.
Congressmember Jerry Nadler has now rescheduled the vote for today at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The first article of impeachment, abuse of power, centers on how President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Democratic lawmakers say Trump then tried to cover up his actions, leading to the second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress. Democracy Now! Will be live streaming the impeachment hearing today at our website, democracynow.org. In Algeria, thousands of people have taken to the streets to denounce Thursday's presidential election as a farce.
The elections must fall. There are no elections. These people are the elections. No to elections in these conditions. These people are heroes.
Activists called for people to boycott Thursday's presidential election to replace Algeria's longtime president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was forced from power by a mass uprising in April. There was record low participation in Thursday's election, and early results suggest no candidate received the 50% of votes needed to win outright. Protesters say all 5 candidates represent a continuation of Algeria's corrupt ruling elite. Earlier this week, 2 previous Algerian prime ministers were convicted and sentenced to prison over a corruption scandal that also ensnared other top government officials and businessmen in Algeria. Burma's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has asked the International Court of Justice at The Hague to drop the genocide case against Burma.
Myanmar requests the court to remove the case from its list. In the alternative, to reject the request for the indication of provisional measures submitted by the Gambia.
During the International Court hearings, the former Nobel Peace Prize winner repeatedly tried to deny the Burmese military has carried out genocide against the Muslim Rohingya, although she never once used the word Rohingya during her speeches. The Burmese military killed and raped thousands of Rohingya and forced more than 700,000 to flee into neighboring Bangladesh in a brutal army crackdown in 2017. In India, police killed at least 2 protesters in the state of Assam amid massive demonstrations against the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which many have denounced as a major step toward the official marginalization of India's 200 million Muslims. The upper house of parliament has passed the highly controversial legislation which provides a path to citizenship for immigrants from Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan unless they're Muslim. The government's also arrested hundreds of protesters, cut off internet access, imposed curfews in parts of northeast India amidst ongoing protests against the citizenship bill. In Iraq, thousands of anti-government protesters have gathered in Baghdad's Tahrir Square to demand the nationwide protest movement in Iraq remain peaceful and to condemn the brutal killing of a teenager on Thursday. The 16-year-old was stabbed to death and his body was strung up from a traffic pole after rumors circulated he killed a number of anti-government demonstrators. It appears he'd actually fired a gun into the air to try to convince demonstrators to stop protesting near his family's home. Police officers stood by during the teenager's killing and allowed it to take place. The leaders of the ongoing protests quickly condemned the attack. Meanwhile, the United Nations has condemned the Iraqi government for killing, arresting, and abducting anti-government protesters during the ongoing demonstrations. Security forces and militias have killed over 400 protesters, and human rights advocates say a number of prominent activists have been disappeared. In France, protests are continuing today as workers remain on strike to protest French President Emmanuel Macron's pension overhaul. Unions are vowing to continue the strike into the holiday period, saying the proposal to effectively raise the retirement age is a red line that cannot be crossed. This is 31-year-old train conductor Cécile Ratour, who is participating in the strike.
I continue to fight for our pensions because what Prime Minister Philippe said was rubbish. It's a blatant smokescreen. They want to divide and conquer. They want to divide the generations.
In Hong Kong, thousands of people took to the streets Thursday to mark 6 months since the pro-democracy protest movement's first major clash with police, when demonstrators prevented lawmakers from advancing an extradition bill that sparked the protests. While the extradition bill has since been scrapped, the demonstrations have continued to rock Hong Kong, with nearly 1 million people marching this past Sunday to demand more democracy. This is a college student at Thursday's march.
This movement is not the end because just a whole beginning. Just because we have a lot of work to do. Also, we think that this movement need to, and we call more people to against some kind of government which is very evil and is is against the human rights.
Back in the United States, a shocking Department of Homeland Security memo obtained by BuzzFeed News reveals how inadequate medical care contributed to the deaths of at least 4 immigrants in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The memo includes revelations from an ICE whistleblower about how one man died from meningitis after grossly negligent care. The whistleblower also said official reports on one of the 4 deaths were very misleading. The DHS memo also includes reports of immigrants being administered incorrect medication or being given such grossly inadequate medical care they had to have preventable surgeries. One of the victims of medical neglect was an 8-year-old child whose rare infection inside his skull was misdiagnosed as an ear infection. He was given only eardrops. A few weeks later, after the infection spread, the child had to have his frontal bones surgically removed. And President Trump has attacked Swedish 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg, who has just been named Time Magazine Person of the Year. She's the youngest person to ever receive the honor. On Thursday, Trump attacked the teenager on Twitter, tweeting, quote, "Greta must work on her anger management problem, then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta, chill," he tweeted. In response to President Trump's attack, Greta changed her Twitter bio to mock the President of the United States, writing, quote, "A teenager working on her anger management problem, currently chilling and watching a good old-fashioned movie with a friend," unquote. Trump's Twitter spat with a teenager comes after President Trump did not win Time Magazine Person of the Year last year, instead being named runner-up. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. We're broadcasting from inside the United Nations Climate Change Conference here in Madrid, Spain. But we begin today's show in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party have won a decisive majority in the highly anticipated general election, winning seats in Labour Party strongholds and all but guaranteeing Britain's exit from the European Union by early next year.
In the Labour Party's worst electoral defeat in 84 years, the Conservatives are projected to win 364 seats in the British House of Commons versus only 203 for the Labour Party. This would give the Conservatives the largest majority since 1987, when Margaret Thatcher was in power.
This is Prime Minister Boris Johnson addressing the nation this morning.
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention. Because this election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people. We will get Brexit done on time by the 31st of January. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. Leaving the European Union as one United Kingdom, taking back control of our laws, borders, money, our trade, immigration system, delivering on the democratic mandate of the people. And at the same time, this One Nation Conservative government will massively increase our investment in the NHS, the health service that represents the very best of our country, with this single beautiful idea.
The election marks a crushing defeat for Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who said Thursday night he would step down as the party's leader after a period of reflection.
Of social justice and the issues of needs of people will not go away just because Brexit is dealt with in the way in which Boris Johnson presumably plans to deal with it at the moment. All those issues will come back centre stage in the debate, and the fundamental Labour message about justice and equality within our society is going to be one that is there for all time, because it's the very core of what my party believes in and what I will always advocate on behalf of my constituency and on behalf of my party. I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign.
The British election also delivered a decisive win for Scottish National Party leader Nicola Sturgeon, who said Friday the election was, quote, an overwhelming endorsement of a second referendum on Scottish independence. Also in Scotland, Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson has stepped down after losing her seat in an election night that left her party with only 11 seats.
For more on what this election means for Brexit, the climate crisis, national health care, and much more, we're joined by two guests. We go to England, to Oxford, where we're joined by George Monbiot, columnist for The Guardian, author of Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. And joining us via Democracy Now! Video stream from Bangalore, India, is Priya Gopal, university lecturer in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge, author of the new book, Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Dissent. George Monbiot, let's go to you in Oxford first. Well, if you can just respond to what took place in your country.
Well, it is a very dark day for everyone who believes in justice, for everyone here who wants a kinder, fairer, greener nation. Arguably the darkest day that we've had since the end of the Second World War in this country. And we've now stepped into the same political arena as the US has with Trump, India has with Modi, as the Philippines have with Duterte, and Brazil with Bolsonaro. These are very dangerous times, just when we need to confront the greatest predicament humankind has ever faced, which is the collapse of our life support systems. Our governments are in the hands of giant toddlers who just want to smash up all our public protections, our public services, any means by which the power of capital and those who accumulate it can be restrained.
George, can you talk, though, speculate about what you think accounts for the scale of the victory? I mean, many thought that Boris Johnson would win this election, but not by such a major landslide.
Well, I think there are several factors. One is that they have learnt from Trump, they have learnt from Modi, they have learnt from the referendum result in the UK 3 years ago. Basically, cheating and lying wins, particularly when you can weaponize it through social media on a massive scale with unaccountable dark ads where nobody knows what anybody else is seeing. That is a highly effective and highly dangerous tactic. And they have refined it so that it is now winning elections all over the world. These are really perilous times for democracy. We also had an opposition in the form of the Labour Party that was quite internally divided. That didn't help at all. It failed for far too long to articulate a clear position on Brexit. It failed to deal with some of its own crises, particularly the anti-Semitism crisis, which it should have moved on much more swiftly and firmly than it did. But we also, it was really swimming against the tide, particularly the power of the billionaire press in this country, the enormous amount of funding poured into the Conservative Party, and a series of other undemocratic forces that align with the radical right now, which has taken over the Conservative Party.
Priya Gopal, you're usually at Cambridge University. You're now in Bangalore, India, but it's certainly interesting to see Britain from that perspective as well. Were you surprised by the results of the election, and what message do you think that it sent?
India, where we've just had the Citizenship Amendment Bill, where ethno-nationalist authoritarian forces have won an election for a second time earlier this year. I think that I simply see Britain as the latest footnote, if you like, in what George just referred to as the global perilous state that democracy in. What we're seeing is the authoritarian right rampaging across the globe, and in a way Britain has simply joined Brazil, India, and Hungary, Poland, and of course the USA. So we do need to see what is happening in Britain in a global context, and that should worry us very greatly.
And Priya, could you talk specifically about what George said about the Labour Party itself being internally divided, and also the fact that the Labour Party doesn't quite represent the working classes, or was abandoned by the working classes? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the argument that it was abandoned by the working classes is greatly overstated. I mean, for one thing, we have yet to get the final numbers, the final voting demographics. I think that when people say that Labour was abandoned by the working classes, they're actually often making a slightly racialized statement. What they're saying is that people who consider themselves white and so-called indigenous Britons have voted against migrants and ethnic minorities. And it is important to point out here that the working classes in Britain, like the working classes pretty much anywhere else, including the USA, is not homogenous. It consists of different communities. It consists of different religions. And so there is no yardstick by which you can say Labour was abandoned as a whole by the working classes. We don't know that for sure. And even with the Brexit referendum, the working class vote, I would say, was divided. Yes, there were certain Labour strongholds that did vote leave, and that did vote leave on an explicitly xenophobic anti-migrant platform, which was furthered by the kinds of lying and cheating on the part of the media that George referred to earlier. As far as Labour itself is concerned, yes, it is a party that is divided against itself, but it is also true that they failed to take not just a clear position on Brexit, but I think they failed to educate people. They failed to educate their own constituency about what sorts of lies were being spread, particularly the lie that austerity was somehow the responsibility of Europe, when in fact the austerity that people were pushing back against is very much a Tory program. And this was a very successful lie. And I think that because they didn't take a sufficiently clear position on Brexit early on, they also failed to educate their own constituencies about the ins and outs of Brexit. And I think that has rebounded against them at the end of the day.
George Monbiot, Gary Young writes in The Guardian, Labour will now have to face the fact that the electorate did not abandon Labour for the centre. They went either to the far right in England and Wales or to the social democratic nationalist alternative in Scotland. You have called this election the climate election. Do you now think that's what this was about?
Well, it's really disappointing that, for the first time, we had some very strong climate and environmental policies in the platforms of several of the major parties. And that, to me, was quite exciting. But you would hardly have known it from the media coverage. It was scarcely touched on. Just as the politicians are finally taking these issues seriously, the media, as always, turns its back on them and looks the other way and talks about Brexit and talks about immigration and the economy and crime and all the old 20th century issues. And so it's, this great opportunity we had, finally, to take action on our greatest ever crisis has once more been lost. And that is tremendously disappointing. I mean, obviously I don't trust Johnson on anything, but I particularly don't trust him on environmental issues. His whole shtick is really to just give the oligarchs what they want, whether they're onshore oligarchs or offshore oligarchs. It doesn't matter, because they support his party and he in turn supports them. And they want a free hand to treat the living planet as their dustbin and to treat the people of the planet as their underpaid and exploited workforce or consumers. And so the idea that he would be a champion of environmental values, unfortunately, is a very remote hope indeed.
I want to turn to Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking this morning.
You, the people of this country, voted to be carbon neutral in this election. You voted to be carbon neutral by 2050, and we'll do it. You also voted to be Corbyn neutral by Christmas, by the way, and we'll do that too.
George Monbiot, if you would respond to what he just said.
Yeah, well, that is the government's official position, carbon neutral by 2050. It's far too little, far too late. Unfortunately, the science tells us we have to move much faster than that.
Neutral.
Oh, well, just that's Boris Johnson with his silly sound bites. Look, one thing we've learnt in this election is you cannot believe a word that Johnson says. He is an inveterate liar. He lies and lies and lies and cheats and lies and cheats and lies. So if he says we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, it's not true, because nothing he says is true. He will say whatever he needs to say to get through the situation that he happens to be in. But it's up to us, those of us who are now the resistance in this country, that's how I see us, to fight him every step of the way, whether it's on environmental, climate issues, it's critical that we do so, whether it's on social justice issues, whether it's on the defence of our public services. We will fight him, and we will develop alternatives, and we will resist, and we will rebuild, and we will come out of this stronger than before. But we're going to have to show a lot of unity. We're going to have to drop the recriminations. We're going to have to invest in solidarity, invest in mutual aid, help each other out of this appalling mess that we've fallen into in the UK. We can do that, but we're going to have to climb out of a pretty deep well of despair first.
But, George, could you explain what the implications of Boris Johnson's electoral win is? I mean, this massive majority that the Conservatives have won, the results mean that Johnson will be the most powerful Prime Minister since Tony Blair won a landslide for Labour in 1997. What do you anticipate Johnson will do with this landslide? What kinds of legislation will he put forward?
So Johnson has no vision for the country. He has a vision for a particular powerful class who are basically oligarchs, extremely rich people who use their money, often unrecorded, to fund the lobby groups, to fund the Conservative Party directly, to fund our equivalent of political action committees, which are just beginning to take off in the UK, to get what they want. And he's been in their pocket throughout his political career. And he knows what they want. They want an offshore, deregulated economy where public protections are torn down, where public services are ripped open to competition with the private sector, or indeed to direct privatisation and capture by the private sector. And environmental regulations will go to the wall because those restrict the ability of the oligarchs to make even more money. They want to be able to dump their pollutants. They want to be able to seize natural wealth without paying for it. We're in a very dangerous position indeed, because this charlatan, this liar, this cheat has taken power with a massive majority in this country. And we don't even have the brakes on the system that you have in the US. At least there are institutional means of resisting Donald Trump, not least Congress. But we don't have any such brakes because we don't have a clear separation of powers in this country. We don't have a formal constitution in this country. Basically, a prime minister with a large majority can take almost sovereign powers. He can capture the old powers that the monarch used to have. This is a very perilous situation indeed.
Before you go, Paul, if you can talk more about Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who says he's going to step down after a period of reflection the party goes through. Where do you think they should be focusing? What do you think he, and we should look overall at the Labour Party, did right and wrong? And also, what do you think this means about the balance of power with Britain? I mean, with Brexit about to happen and both Boris Johnson and Trump, such close allies, what that alliance will mean? But start with Corbyn.
Well, I think there are two Jeremy Corbyns we should be talking about, in all honesty. There is the Jeremy Corbyn, the man, who is like any other political leader, he's made his mistakes. He also did produce a vision for a significantly more progressive and reformed social democratic system. And he did put the idea out there. And I think that we should, in some sense, acknowledge the fact that in these extremely right-wing, perilous times, where in many countries there isn't an alternative, I mean, India is a good example, there isn't a viable opposition. He and others in the Labour Party did put forward a viable oppositional program, a viable imaginative alternative, a viable progressive vision. And Jeremy Corbyn, the man, mistakes and warts and failures notwithstanding, I think is owed a debt of gratitude for having put an alternative out there. There is also Jeremy Corbyn, the media myth. And I do think we should not underestimate how deeply vicious, how deeply mendacious the media, the billionaire plutocratic media in Britain has been, and the construction of Corbyn as a far-left anti-Semite, notwithstanding his not very good handling of the anti-Semitism issue in the Labour Party, the painting of him personally as an anti-Semite and as a kind of far-left ideologue. I mean, he's even been described on the BBC as a blazing ideologue, which is just utterly ludicrous, given that he is essentially a fairly middle-of-the-road social democrat committed to fairly middle-of-the-road social democratic reforms. So I think there are two Jeremy Corbyns, and I think the real Jeremy Corbyn, mistakes notwithstanding, is owed a debt of thanks. In terms of the larger global picture, I think what we really need to worry about is a global right wing. I mean, already in these elections, we have seen the interference of groups linked to the BJP who mobilized fiercely amongst British Indians, claiming that the Labour Party, in addition to being anti-Semitic, was also supposedly anti-Hindu. Now, in part, this is because Corbyn is a long-standing critic of Modi, and in part because the Labour Party took a principled position on the lockdown in Kashmir. But what we do see is a global right wing. We've seen Trump more or less interfere with British electoral politics, and we have seen the Indian right wing interfere with British electoral politics in ways that I think would have been condemned immediately if this had been happening in any other kind of country with any other kind of foreign powers. So I think we really need to be on the alert for what is happening internationally and on a global scale, and the extent to which right-wing forces, ethno-nationalist authoritarian forces are working hand in hand, and the extent to which they have already bolstered Boris Johnson and his undoubtedly deeply damaging program that is ahead of us now.
George Monbiot, right now, we're just looking at an article or comments by Mehdi Hassan, who wrote about what this means, particularly for Muslims, for women. He wrote, "Dark day for minorities in the UK, especially for British Muslims who watched as a man who said Islam was the problem mocked veiled Muslim women and also turned a blind eye to massive anti-Muslim hatred, and his party was just given a landslide majority by their fellow Britons." George, your response?
Well, it's a long time since we've had an overtly racist prime minister in this country. There's been dog whistle racism, but in this case, he just comes out and says it, similar to the way that Trump does. And this is a very frightening time indeed. The stuff he said about Muslims, the stuff he said about people of colour. And then in the manifesto, an actual stated commitment effectively to wipe out another threatened group, which are the Romani gypsies and travellers in this country, who are a protected ethnic group. They were also subject to the Holocaust. About 500,000 Romanis and Sinti were killed by the Nazis, and yet here they are actually in the Conservative manifesto, which basically says we're going to drive them out. We're going to engage in a cultural cleansing, effectively, of these people from our country. And either they're going to go and just live in houses and not pursue their culture anymore, or they're going to be in prison. We're going to jail them for pursuing their culture. It couldn't be more blatant. It couldn't be more terrifying. But it's there, right in black and white, in their platform. So, you know, this is really, really frightening. And we know that whenever he runs into trouble, Johnson is going to use xenophobia and racism and scapegoating of immigrants, of Muslims, of the poor and the weak in general, of Romani and travellers in particular. He's going to use all that to deflect attention from the many problems that he's going to run into, particularly as he tries to implement Brexit, particularly as some of his lies and cheating are exposed. He's going to turn it towards the classic scapegoating of minority peoples, with potentially very frightening implications for those peoples. And it's up to all of us who believe in social justice to stand in solidarity with those peoples and defend them from the inevitable attacks.
And George, we just have a minute now, but if you could comment on what you think the majority, the massive majority for the Tories, means for Scotland. Does this mean that there will be a second referendum, or that there ought to be, on independence?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that there will be. I mean, certainly the Scots are going to be pushing for it very hard now. Scotland was very much anti-Brexit. The large majority want to stay in the European Union. With independence, they would be able to do that. They would be able to become an independent member of the European Union, and they won't be in the position of having the block of concrete, which is the UK, thrown out of the boat with their ankle attached to it, which is how it's going to be with them for Brexit if they stay within the Union, within the United Kingdom. So I would be surprised if Scotland does not leave the United Kingdom before long. We could potentially see Northern Ireland going the same way. That's a possibility. We're looking at the breakup of the United Kingdom, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I support the Scots in their pursuit of independence, but it's just one of the many implications of these really volatile times which we now face.
And we have 30 seconds for Priya Gopal in Bangalore, usually in Cambridge, England. You tweeted the coming months, two things vital everywhere: coalitions and alliances and a global perspective and real internationalism. What gives you hope at this point?
What gives me hope is people organizing, for instance, in India, where the situation is extremely dire, people calling for civil disobedience against the new racist discriminatory law against Muslims, people calling civil servants and police officers resigning from their positions, people refusing to accept what is happening to Kashmir and in Kashmir, people forming alliances to stand between the state and vulnerable populations, and people making alliances across civil society organizations, indigenous peoples who are standing up to protect resources and forests. And I think that we need alliances within countries and across countries, and we need to resist. Civil disobedience, I think, would be a very good start.
Priya Gopal, I want to thank you so much for being with us, university lecturer in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge. Her new book, Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Dissent. And George Monbiot, journalist, author, columnist with The Guardian, his most recent book, Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. When we come back, we look at how rich countries are continuing to evade cutting emissions in these final days of the climate summit. Cop-out 25? Stay with us. Adagio in G minor, Albinoni's Adagio performed by the London Philharmonic and David Perry. This is Democracy Now! I am Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we broadcast from inside the UN Climate Summit here in Madrid, Spain, in its final days.
While deadly droughts, flooding, cyclones and wildfires rage outside the conference center, the rich countries most responsible for the climate emergency have spent the talks dialing back ambition and blocking progress. That's what activists, scientists, indigenous and grassroots climate leaders are charging in the last days of this year's climate conference as 2 weeks of negotiations wrap up without crucial commitments from the countries most responsible for global emissions.
This week, more than 70 developing countries have announced they'll accelerate their climate plans, and 72 countries have signed on to goals to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But major carbon emitters, Australia, China, India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia have made no such promises, while the U.S. is slated to pull out of the Paris Agreement entirely by next year.
Meanwhile, a new study finds that the climate crisis is already leading to a massive increase in the number of refugees being displaced around the world. In Berkeley, California, we're joined by policy analysts with the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the co-author of the new report, Climate Refugees, the Climate Crisis and Rights Denied.
And here in Madrid, Spain, we're joined by Salim El-Haq, climate scientist, director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, advising the bloc of least developed countries in the climate negotiations. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Salim El-Haq, let's begin with you. I mean, you have, as so many have said, these climate emergencies taking place around the world right now. You've got the wildfires in Australia. You've got the floods. You've got the droughts. You've got climate migration at a level we haven't seen. What is happening here? Is this a cop-out? And what role is the U.S. playing?
Well, I think the year 2019 will, in hindsight, be seen as the tipping point when human-induced climate change became reality. We can now attribute many of the things you just said, the magnitude of them being way over anything we've seen before, and that can now be attributed to the fact that we have already increased global temperature by well over 1 degree centigrade, and that is already having the impacts. And we're headed for 3 degrees and nowhere near the 1.5 degrees that we want to do. So what we are seeing in reality is that the impacts are causing damage, they're causing loss of life, loss of biodiversity, and what we need the Conference of Parties to do is step up to that challenge that is being given from the rest of the world, particularly the young children of the world who were out here in Madrid, 500,000 of them last Friday. But I don't see a lot of signs of the negotiators responding to that, and the U.S. is being particularly difficult.
What is the U.S. doing? I mean, on the one hand, Trump is pulling the U.S. out of the climate conference, but they are also, as each day goes by, working to dilute any kind of lead up to next year, the evaluation of the Paris Climate Accord.
So the specific technical point here in Madrid in the 25th Conference of Parties is something called the review of the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage. The developing countries have a united front here. We want that review to take it forward with an implementation arm and a finance arm. And the finance part is something that the United States is completely against. And so far we haven't got a decision on that.
Explain finance.
Funding for loss and damage as opposed to funding for adaptation and mitigation.
Right. That's a lot of UN speak. Most people don't really get it.
Basically, giving some funding to the victims of the impacts of climate change that we are now seeing, allowing funding to be raised for the victims.
You know, Salim, if you could just give a broader sense. I mean, we've been coming to the Climate Summit for many years, as indeed have you. Many people argue that even though the pace of change is very, very slow, it's an important venue for developing countries to be able to express in solidarity their position to the richer countries. What do you see as the significance of these annual meetings where it seems every year very little gets achieved that's in the interest of the people who've been suffering the most from the effects of the climate crisis?
Well, we live in an unjust and unequal world. And as the vulnerable, poor countries, the least developed countries that I advise, 47 of them in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, including my country, Bangladesh, this is the only game in town where we have a seat at the table where we can actually say something and hope that the other side will listen. A lot of the time they don't listen, but sometimes they do. We're hoping in Madrid we'll get them to listen within the next few hours that we have left here.
Describe what's happening in your own country of Bangladesh.
So my country, Bangladesh, is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We are a delta, live on a delta of two of the major rivers of the world, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. We have a population of 160 plus million people living in less than 150,000 square kilometers. So a population density of over 1,000 per square kilometer. Very vulnerable, very generally poor, but nevertheless one of the most resilient countries. We have one of the best cyclone warning and shelter systems in the world. We can warn and evacuate more than 2.5 million people. We recently had a major cyclone where we did that. And so we are struggling, but we are rising to the challenge of dealing with the impacts of climate change. But there's a limit to what we can do. 1.5 degrees we can manage. 3 degrees we can't.
We're going to go to a break, and then we're going to come back to this discussion, and we're going to talk about this massive crisis of climate migration. We're talking millions and millions of people, the numbers only promising to grow. We're with Salim al-Haq from the Bangladeshi climate movement, a climate scientist. Joining us also will be Hossein Ayazi at the University of California, Berkeley, who just left but did a report here on climate refugees. Stay with us.
Anoche soñé que mi padre estaba vivo y pescábamos juntos en el río, como aquella vez a mediados de verano que de niños nos bañamos en el río. El que fue testigo generación tras generación
by Amaral. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We're broadcasting from inside the UN Climate Summit here in Madrid, Spain, in the last few days of this climate summit that people are calling a cop-out, that we inside the climate summit have seen mass protests here, and yet still it limps along. And outside, the number of people who are so affected by the climate catastrophe.
A new study finds that the climate crisis is already leading to a massive increase in the number of refugees being displaced around the world. In Berkeley, California, we are joined by Hussein Ayazi, policy analyst with the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the co-author of the new report, Climate Refugees, the Climate Crisis and Rights Denied. And still with us here in Madrid is Salim Ul-Haq, climate scientist and the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. He's advising the bloc of least developed countries here in the climate negotiations. So, Hussein Ayazi, could you lay out what you found in this report on climate refugees? How many are there? What countries are the worst affected?
Yes, so we're finding in the report that permanent and short-term displacement due to the climate crisis is only increasing. In 2018, for example, of the 28 million new displaced persons, over 17 million were displaced due to weather-related natural disasters. And these displacements were by and large across the global south. One need only look to the droughts in Pakistan, the floods in India, in Nigeria, the crop failures and droughts in the Central American dry corridor that was behind the Central American migration caravan, the migrant caravan that dominated news cycles last year. And the second finding in the report is that although we generally refer to climate-induced displaced persons as climate refugees, this is actually not a legally recognized term, as in this is not a term within international refugee protections. And in fact, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees does not officially endorse the term climate refugees. And this is really emblematic of the issue at large, in that across international refugee law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and other bodies of law, protections for climate refugees are limited, piecemeal, and by and large not legally binding.
So you were here, is that right, Hussein Ayazi?
No, I was not at COP.
But some of your colleagues were. This issue of climate refugees right now, how does what's happening inside the UN Climate Summit affect what's happening outside? This discussion we're having with you about climate refugees, and if you can talk more about, for example, what you mean by petro-persecution.
Sure. So I'll start with your second question, in that petro-persecution is the main notion that we're advancing within the report. And it's a term, basically we've identified a major barrier in negotiations toward refugee protections for climate refugees. In order to obtain refugee status, one need cross international borders due to a real risk of persecution on the basis of one's race, ethnicity, religion, other circumstances. But this notion of persecution within refugee law assumes that the source of persecution, the actor, the persecutor, is either one's country of origin, the government, or internal to one's country of origin. And this is not how forced migration under the climate crisis works. In fact, when we think of forced migration under the climate crisis, it's fundamentally impossible to tie a specific climate-related natural disaster to a specific actor of persecution, whether it's corporations, fossil fuel corporations, or fossil fuel-dependent industrial processes. Additionally, many of the countries that are at greatest risk of the effects of the climate crisis are in fact working hard to protect their own populations, to keep them in place, to ensure that they have the livelihoods to remain in place. And so what we're trying to do with this notion of petro-persecution is, one, delink the notion of persecution from territory. By that I mean the climate crisis is a global phenomenon, and so we need to recognize it as such within international refugee law. And the second thing that we want to advance within this notion of petro-persecution is that the actor of persecution is actually our global dependence upon fossil fuels and the global investment patterns behind this dependence.
And Hussein, your report doesn't just look at climate refugees in the sense of people who are forced to flee across borders, but also at people who've been forced to flee their homes within countries, internally displaced people. Could you talk about that? What did you find? How many people are affected and where?
Yes, so by and large, most migration due to the climate crisis and most forced migration in general is internal. And this is something that we state clearly in the report, and that is actually people displaced internally do have the legally recognized ability to gain ability to resettle within their country of origin and stay put. And the issue that we found in the report is that while internally displaced peoples do have the means to for recourse and redress in some way or another, that this is not at all the case for peoples forced to cross international borders. So when we discuss refugees, whether climate refugees or not, we're really talking about movement across international borders, and how as certain island nations, for example, are at risk of complete inundation or desertification makes entire countries potentially inhabitable, that people are forced to flee their country and that there's no place for them to resettle at home. And this is the major gap in international refugee law that we're shining a light on.
And food refugees?
Yes, so this notion of food refugees is one that we are using to define people or communities displaced due to growing food insecurity. And this can be due to a number of dynamics. This could be due to land grabs or natural resource grabs, seed monopolies, international free trade agreements, basically what people might describe as the corporate food regime or corporate food system. And this structural vulnerability that communities face as a result of this larger system actually intersects with the climate crisis, in the sense that natural disasters exacerbated by the climate crisis force already vulnerable peoples to search elsewhere for sustainable livelihoods. And so while we recognize that the term climate refugee is different from food refugee, the two are really interrelated and need to be recognized as both distinct categories, yet fundamentally inseparable.
Very quickly before we end, Salim ul-Haq, this year we're in Madrid, Spain. Next year, Glasgow. What do you expect to happen in this time? Or does it even matter what happens here? Is it the action in the streets the only thing that makes a difference, like the young climate activists by the millions going on school climate strike, demanding that their leaders pay attention?
I think it still matters. I think it does matter, because this is where the leaders are. This is where the leaders are negotiating. They have to listen to their own kids who are out on the streets shouting at them and telling them that they're ruining their own kids' future. So we are still hopeful that they will listen. Between now and Glasgow, we hope we'll get a result in Madrid that will, on the particular issue that I'm concerned about, get a funding mechanism for loss and damage opened up for discussion, which we can come back to in Glasgow and see whether or not we can actually make it happen. We're not asking for it to happen here. We're asking for it to be allowed to happen next year in Glasgow. We're hopeful that we might get that.
Well, we want to thank you both so much for being with us. Salim ul-Haq, climate scientist, director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and Hussein Ayazi, policy analyst and co-author of the new report, Climate Refugees, the Climate Crisis and Rights Denied. We'll link to that report at democracynow.org. That does it for our coverage right here on site at the 25th United Nations Climate Change Summit. We want to say special thanks to our crew right here in Madrid, but we'll let them speak their own names in their own words.
Pablo Fernández.
Antonio Herrera.
Irene Briones.
Jesús Parreño.
Carlos Vargas.
Luke Mylander.
Ramón Ausán.
Daniel Gómez Núñez.
And thank you also to the crew who helped us with our live crew last Friday from El Cumbre, Social and Climate, Ana Galatea Marina Panuelas and Daniel Vasquez, and to the Democracy Now! Crew here on the ground in Madrid, Libby Rainey, Carla Wills, Nermeen Sheikh, John Hamilton, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Laura Gottesdina, Maria Taracena, Julia Thomas, Adriano Contreras, Dennis Moynihan, and Maria Carrion. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, welcome back, and to Miriam Barnard. And a very welcome to the world to Maliki. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.